end of it. They don't even bother to take time to just spend that extra minute and see that, oh, wait, that's not possible in this specific case.
Let me give a quick shout-out to the chat room, Amy. I'd like
Sure.
to thank After Dark Radio, Brilliant Essence. We've got 4 guests in tonight with those auto-generated numbers. IQXS, Janet L, RD47, Rev1 Will, Spin Dave, Stevenson Metal, Europe 8, and Veronica V. Thanks, everyone, for coming to the show. I always appreciate that. Amy, if there's 2 or 3 things wrong with the skull, the child usually dies. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that's correct. We're incredibly resilient beings, but unfortunately, if you get a few major things wrong, especially in a primitive society like, for example, Mexico 900 years ago, you really can't afford to have more than a couple of things wrong with you. If you have a cleft palate or something, you're probably going to survive it. But if you have a cleft palate and a spinal problem and a skull deformity, you're just not going to. And in the Star Child's case, we don't have 2 or 3 or 4. We have over 10 standard deviations from the norm. That means 10 really, really different things. 10 things about this skull that are classified as radically different from the human norm.
And the other thing that the skeptics say is that it's a hydrocephalic skull. And why don't you explain to our listeners what that means?
Yes, that's a really good one, Mark. I'm so glad you brought it up. The classic answer that we get from anyone who doesn't really want to look at this and doesn't want to accept that it might be something really unusual that's going to rattle their cage is that it's a cradle-boarded hydrocephalic. So we've already gone over cradle boarding. That's when the back of the head gets flattened. Now, the Star Child skull, as we said, it has that very bulbous upper part of its head, very small lower face. It's got a flattened rear of the head, and it has a dent down the middle of the skull. It also has bulging parietals. That's the bones at the side of your skull, kind of above your ears. It's a big bone plate. In the Star Child skull, these are expanded. They're just puffed out like 2 little balloons at the side of the skull. And so the classic explanation that we get for that is something called hydrocephaly, which means water in the brain or water on the brain. Basically, it's where the cerebrospinal fluid doesn't drain in and out of the skull normally like it's supposed to. It gets trapped inside the skull, either between the brain and the skull wall or inside the brain itself, and causes that whole cranial region to expand. It basically blows the skull up like it was a balloon. Now, when you're younger, your skull is made up of a number of different bone plates, which as you age, as you go through childhood, they fuse into the one solid skull bone. But the places where those bony plates fused are called your suture lines. It's basically like a zipper where the 2 plates of bone got joined together, and it's always a weak spot. The plates of bone themselves are hard, they're solid, but those suture lines are the weakest part. So anytime you have pressure inside your skull, the first place that's going to bulge up or get pushed out of shape are those suture lines. Now, the Star Child skull actually has a dent down the center suture line called the sagittal suture. It's the one right down the middle of the top of your skull. So if there was any kind of pressure inside the skull, that would be the first place that would bulge upward. And instead of bulging upward, it actually dips inward. The parts of the skull in the Star Child that are expanded are those hard bone parietal plates. So anyone that comes up and says, oh, well, the reason this is expanded is hydrocephaly, well, that's not possible. That's like saying you can blow up a balloon and somehow miraculously leave a crease in the middle of it. It's just simply not possible. It is the most basic, easy condition to explain, and anyone that after all these years is still trying to say that it's hydrocephaly or cradle-boarded hydrocephaly really just has never bothered to look at the skull. And again, a 5-year-old could see this. If they're not seeing it, it's just willful ignorance. It's one of those bad scientists that really just doesn't want this unusual thing to be recognized. And I hate to be so harsh and call them bad scientists, but I think that's what they are. I think it's your job as a scientist or as an academic to be the person who asks questions. And if you're going to stand there and say, oh, well, this doesn't conform to what I already know, therefore it must be wrong, that's just bad science. And it really irks me because they turn around and say, we're the ones doing bad science. Well, we're the ones saying, here's our theory, let's try and disprove it. Not, here's my theory, no one tell me anything that might rattle it, I need to hold on to this. So it's just really unfortunate that so many people out there are still holding on to bad explanations like the cradle-boarded hydrocephaly, and I'm so glad you brought it up so we could explain it.
What is the probability that the being that had the skull was a human-alien hybrid?
Well, that's a tough one to answer. We're doing new DNA testing at the moment that keeps giving us really surprising results. It's the most recent results that we've been able to release. And just to be clear, as soon as we have a result that we're able to verify a little bit just to make sure that there wasn't some mistake in the machine, there wasn't some other contamination or problem that caused it, as soon as we get a result that we're pretty sure of, we announce it to everyone. And I don't know that we've been really wrong about anything yet, but if we were, we would admit to it. But we're just huge fans of getting information out there as soon as we possibly can. So this is really cutting edge from the horse's mouth stuff. It hasn't even been verified enough times and hasn't had enough time for our geneticists to go through and write up a formal report on it yet. But the preliminary results that we have from this new round of DNA testing is that some of the DNA that's being pulled out from the star-child skull bone is normal human DNA. In fact, the part that we were looking at most recently came off the first chromosome. Now, other parts of the DNA that are being pulled out we're sending them through the National Institute of Health database, which contains all of the genetic information that anyone has recovered using government funding. That's one of the stipulations. If you take government money to do research, you have to make your results public. And so they put those results in this big database that's held by the National Institute of Health, and they have something called the BLAST tool, which is basically a computer program where you enter in the DNA sequence that you have, and it goes through in a matter of moments and cross-checks that against all of these samples. And we're talking about billions and billions and billions and billions of base pairs within this entire database, and we're running through groups of a few hundred base pairs at a time, looking for a match or looking for anything that's similar enough that the machine can pick it up. And in going through and doing that, again, we found some that are normal and human, and that's fine, but we're getting a pretty substantial percentage of them that when we run them through, they come back and it says, nothing similar found in the database. This is so different from all of the DNA that we've ever found on planet Earth to this point that we can't find any remote match. It's not close to any kind of bacteria, it's not close to any kind of fish, any kind of bird, any kind of mammal, any kind of marsupial, not close to any human or human relative or primate. This is just completely different from anything that we found on planet Earth to this point. And when you have evidence like that, where you have human DNA and essentially DNA that doesn't look like it's from planet Earth, that really leaves open the possibility that maybe it is an alien-human hybrid. Or if, as intervention theory states, we're all hybrids right now, we're all the product of alien hybridization with native Earth mammals, maybe that human DNA that we're recovering at the moment is actually DNA that aliens have as well, and we have it because we're a product of a hybridization process with them. At this stage, it's just too early to say anything other than, wow, we have something really important here. Pay attention. This is going to be huge.
If it is proven that the DNA from the skull is at least in part not of Earth origin, what impact would that have on the world?
Oh, well, that would be huge. That would be disclosure. I think it's going to be hard to prove it to a point that no one ever questions it. I mean, I'm sure if you tried hard enough, you could find someone that still thinks the Earth is flat. And no one really stands to lose anything if the Earth is flat or if the Earth is round. With the Star Child skull, you're talking about having to rewrite textbooks. You're talking about professors having to go back to learning things again, having to maybe reassess who gets funding for what. A lot of these established projects right now that are getting funded suddenly become less important, and funding has to go to figuring out what this means, what to do next, what other kind of alien human hybrids are there, what other kind of alien things are there, what does it mean. It's going to ruffle a lot of feathers. Anytime someone wins, someone else has to lose. There isn't just miraculously going to be more funding to take care of this. Someone is going to end up losing their job or losing their funding so that other research can be funded. So I think there's going to be a lot of resistance from people who maybe even personally believe that it's an alien, maybe personally believe that it should be researched, but hey, I've got a family. I need to keep my job. I need to keep my funding. I think it's going to be a real dogfight, and I think that it's not just going to be religious people or zealots or this, that, or the other. I think that a lot of it is just going to be regular working people who are afraid of how it's going to impact them personally, who are concerned because it's a scary thing. We have a 900-year-old bone. That's not really scary. I mean, it's dead. It doesn't bite. It's only got one tooth left. It's not something that people have to be afraid of in the way that I think a lot of people would be if, for example, a UFO landed on the White House lawn. But it's still a very disturbing thing to think, okay, what else do we don't know? How wrong are we? If this is an alien hybrid, where are the other aliens? What's going to happen? I think it's going to be a huge amount of unrest, and I think it could really go either way. Either the cooler heads are going to prevail that believe what I personally believe, which is, yes, there are probably aliens out there, and if they wanted to do something bad to us, they probably would have done it a long time ago. I can't imagine that they're going to wait until the day after we know that they're there and then all of a sudden decide to come and blow us up. They would have done it by now, I would think. So hopefully that is going to be the mood where everyone just is enlightened and is not freaking out and is able to just proceed with their lives as normal. But there is always the chance that there's just going to be panic, that there's going to be real problems. And I think that as we're seeing different governments in the world announcing that they are aware of UFOs, that this is something that needs further investigation, as last year you have the Vatican coming out and saying, yes, we think there probably are aliens, and you know what, that's okay. They're just part of God's bigger plan, and if they want it, we think we can convert them. They're welcome to be Catholics if they'd like to be. I think that all of these people chipping away at the edges, saying to people, yes, it's okay, we think they're out there and we think it's okay, I think that might be preparing the way for the kind of disclosure that the Star Child skull could bring forth. I think that they recognize that it's going to happen, it's probably going to happen fairly soon, and that if they don't prepare the public for it, there is going to be a massive panic. And so I think that right now we're being groomed to accept that this is the new way that it's going to be, and I certainly hope so at least. I think it will be a really good thing for civilization in general, and I think that there's a really good chance that those cooler heads will prevail, that everything's going to be just fine, and we'll all get up the next day and go to work just like we did every other day.
There's a question from the chat room. Brilliant Essence asks, was there anything of interest found with the skull that might tell us something about the culture it came from? I don't think there was. There was just the skull there and maybe some other bones. There was a human skull and then the Star Child skull, but there wasn't anything else found, was there?
No, there wasn't. It was actually found by a young girl, a teenage girl, whose parents were Mexican, and they moved to America and then took her back as a teenager to see the village where they grew up. And so she was off exploring one day, and she tells a story of finding the two skeletons, the human skeleton just lying on its back on the ground of the cave, and then the Starchild skull skeleton, complete skeleton, buried in a very shallow grave in the ground next to the female skeleton. And the story is that the arm bone of the Starchild skull skeleton was sticking up out of the ground and was wrapped around the arm bone of the human skeleton, as though the Starchild had died. She'd buried it, she'd lain down